So Gabriella is one of the founders of and the executive director of OpenUp. It's a civic technology organization based in Cape Town, I understand it, that develops and supports projects to inform, empower, and activate citizens. She's also a research fellow with the Research ICT Africa, an Atlantic Senior Fellow in Social and Economic Equity, and a member of the Expert on AI and Democracy in Emerging African AI Observatory. So indeed, there's lots of platforms for cooperation here, as we can see. All right, so that's over to you, Gabrielle.
Thanks so much. Let me just make sure I share the right screen and no one gets to see the chaos of my desktop. Much healthier. Okay, can we see this?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk just quickly about a slightly different perspective on AI, which is actually a low-tech perspective from civic tech practitioners, or at least, local innovators in the African region. I think it adds some interesting perspective on AI and its challenges. But OpenUp is a civic technology hub based in Cape Town, but essentially we build tools, open data, and provide data training to support active citizens. And we work with both governments, local municipalities and national governments, as well as community-based organizations. I'm going to give some examples of the kinds of work we do, just to give a little background before dropping into what we believe some of the key challenges to be. So we build a lot of open data tools like WASI-Map Next Generation, which is essentially a census mapping tool, and has been used by a variety of partners, including private sector organizations, Youth Explorer, which explores youth as citizen data on mapping, but yeah, a whole lot of different entities to really bring to life open government data and also proprietary data sets. We also developed with National Treasury of Mali, which is the open budget portal for South Africa, which is really fun to actually go have a look at. But what you can see is that we really, most of the technology we develop, we don't develop AI technology, although my chief technology officer does actually in his spare time do AI development in the private sector. Really, we focus significantly on as low tech as we can get. We're very practical tech institution, but particularly given our experience in data governance and open data, I think we have a lot to share in this space. A lot of the key lessons that we've learned is that, there isn't a big body, and also I've done policy research and legal research in this area. I'm actually a lawyer. Don't judge me for it. But there's not a lot of locally developed artificial intelligence actually currently being implemented. There are, of course, a lot of early stage projects that you see, particularly in fintech. But, because a lot of that is very private sector driven, it's very hard to see under the hood of a lot of these projects, and a lot of them are a lot earlier stage of development than their pitch decks might suggest. There is, however, room in the field, to my mind, in the field of algorithmic decision making. So there's a lot of algorithmic decision making used across the region, particularly by the public sector, but also by the private sector. And I think the interesting thing about algorithmic decision-making is it allows you to look at aspects of decision-making that sort of take you beyond the data governance questions. But fundamentally, I think for the region in the field of AI, the question of data and the lack of availability of good quality data, which is both, open data and proprietary data, is still the chief fundamental challenge. for innovators, but also, for trying to create the kinds of AI that can do the forms of human flourishing that I think that AI can be used for. So the African Union has just passed a data policy framework, which they haven't published yet for some reason. I was quite involved in drafting sections on that. So it's interesting to see that, in the context of the African free trade area, in that economic context, that data is being placed very centrally at the forefront of that conversation. And that's good to see, because I think often, the 4IR, or Fourth Industrial Revolution euphoria, can distract policymakers and researchers from some of the more basic questions around the digital divide and digital inequalities that still really make the landscape of the regional reality for technology. I think another aspect of our digital divide is not just a lack of digital access, but also digital skills. And once people are online, how they engage online is very different because of the costs of data and those kinds of things. So a lot of those very basic ICT infrastructure questions, bringing down the costs of handheld devices, bringing down the costs of data, are still fundamentally important to thinking about AI's future. There's another interesting intersection that comes a lot from, our own experiences in being people who develop technology with the public sector. And that is that, the public sector in the region still relies very heavily on private sector capacity. And so public procurement of technology is a very important question for the realities of AI. I was at a meeting with the Department of Public Services and Administration 2 weeks ago, where they talked about the fact that only 0.6% of the South African public service, which is 1.2 million people, have sufficient digital skills. And I think that becomes a question not just for the public sector's development of AI, but also for the public sector's procurement of AI. And sometimes the limitations aren't just not being able to develop that technology yourself, but not understanding the sufficient capacity to have the understanding and imaginary necessary to know what might be a productive use of those technologies. It's that limit in imaginary that I think has really affected a lot of our collaborations. And so there are questions about how the public sector procures technology, how they contract with that technology, particularly, with ideals of agile development and those kinds of things. But I also think that there are opportunities within that space to create obligations for a lot of the instruments that sit within AI ethics currently that are non-obligatory to become obligatory as part of public procurement practices. So in other words, mandating the use of AI impact assessments within government contracting for public sector technologies. And so, obviously, I think there is a lot of work to be done to create the kinds of environments that allow local innovation of AI to flourish, if we want to create the kinds of AI that serve the African populations that we hope to help. And of course, what constantly remains a problem is both policy and laws pacing problem being well outrun. So part of our solutions, or part of what we're working on, we're actually building this website, but the African Observatory on Responsible Artificial Intelligence is a collaboration largely between the Human Sciences Research Council and Research ICT Africa, which will be a central AI observatory to connect African researchers and policymakers. But the kinds of projects that I think also matter are one of, for instance, OpenUp's kinds of projects where we do co-bridge use, because I actually think that building data communities and data capacities on the ground are a fundamental first step to forwarding the kind of AR that we'd like to see. So that's a couple of pieces I've written if anybody is interested. But that's me. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Gabriella. Very interesting, the picture you painted of a very regional reality and the implications for digital citizenship across the continent of Africa. So I look forward to that AU report on the data policy framework. So thank you for drawing our attention to that.